Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. Some great news out of the United States. President Joe Biden has agreed to send a full tank brigade, 31 Abrams tanks, to Ukraine. That was the excuse that the Germans were giving for not allowing Leopard tanks to go to Ukraine, either being provided directly by themselves or even allowing third parties to do so. Now, that is significant because 12 NATO allies in Europe use Leopard tanks, and therefore there is a massive surplus available that would be a game changer on the ground in Ukraine if only they were available. The Germans had been saying, look, we won't do anything unless the US sends Abrams. And Biden, to his credit, had to overrule his own military who advised against it. The Abrams tank is a massive battle tank. It requires 4 people to operate, plus a huge support crew, and it's designed to interoperate specifically with the US military in mind, which has a vast array of support systems, able to keep the gas guzzling Abrams tank, which is around 70 tons, operating on the battlefield. Going along with these 31 tanks, the US will provide 8 recovery vehicles. Because these tanks are so big and heavy, if they get damaged out on the battlefield, they can't just be towed away by a tractor. They need specialized equipment to get them to safety where they can be repaired. The US is going to provide that as well. Now, I would estimate that there will be sort of 4 to 6 months of training required to get the Ukrainian armed forces to be able to use these tanks effectively on the battlefield. But the more important element is the political dimension. So the Germans now have cover of saying, well, the Americans are sending their battle tanks. We're going to send some of our Leopards and allow our allies to provide them as well. The Leopard tank will be the sort of backbone of Ukraine's assault force going forward, I expect. And this also follows an announcement by the British to send 14 Challenger 2 battle tanks into Ukraine as well. So there'll be 3 advanced Western tank types, the Leopard, the Challenger, and the Abrams, all kind of heavy battle tanks, each with their own strengths and drawbacks. For example, the Leopard tank is a fast tank. It can operate in a wide variety of environmental conditions. It can support advancing infantry units and assault vehicles. The Challenger tank, despite its being relatively slow, has super advanced suspension, able to maintain level shooting across all kinds of terrain conditions. The Challenger and the Abrams also have Chatham armor, which is a secret form of ceramic defensive explosive, able to deflect all kinds of incoming anti-tank weaponry. So we're talking super advanced technologies that are going to be on the front line in Ukraine. One of the things that I'm curious about is seeing these Western tanks go up against an advanced military for the first time. The last time we saw kind of Abrams tanks used in a tank battle was in the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein's already totally aging fleet of Soviet era tanks. Well, this time it's going into an advanced military, the Russian armed forces, with their aircraft, their anti-tank weapons, and of course their own tank fleet. It'll be really interesting to see these matchups play out in real life. You can get on YouTube, you can see all kinds of videos of, which one would win between the sort of T-90 and the Abrams, etc. And this is all theoretical. People were just kind of discussing it as a fun form of entertainment. So very different things seeing this play out in real life. And one will expect, given the substandard performance of Russian tanks to date, tanks that theoretically were able to put up some kind of defense against Western anti-tank weapons. Well, that has proven totally false. It is now a question of whether that is just a problem for Russian tanks not living up to the hype, or whether this is a problem facing all heavy assault vehicles, and that the Western tanks will likewise struggle against Russian anti-armor weapons. We will find that out in due course. And on top of that, the French have opened the door to exporting their own light tanks to Ukraine as well. So we're starting to see an open funnel of advanced assault vehicles flood into Ukraine. It will take a couple of months at least before the Leopards arrive in large numbers and can be incorporated into the ranks of the Ukrainian command structure with troops that are fully trained to use the tank. So it won't happen immediately, but hopefully before the spring fighting really heats up, the tanks will be incorporated into Ukraine's armed forces. Now, what does this mean for the war? Why are tanks so significant, both materially but also symbolically. It's symbolically significant because tanks are not defensive weapons. These aren't anti-tank weapons, asymmetric weapons used to defend cities, for urban warfare, for defending territory against oncoming Russian assault. No, tanks are used as an aggressive weapon of war. You use them in the open plains against conventional forces to really take the fight to the enemy and retake territory in the east of Ukraine. The message that the West is now sending is that the victory condition for NATO is the liberation of the east of Ukraine, the liberation of Crimea, and we're prepared to provide Ukraine with the weapon systems and platforms necessary to do that, to actually beat the Russian military in the field in an open battle. Now, the flip side to this is we're also signaling that we're willing to join Russia in the escalation of this conflict. Russia has raised several 100,000 conscripts that it has been training through the winter. It is highly probable that Russia will launch a major spring offensive to try and retake the initiative and conclude hostilities on conditions that are favorable to Russia and preferable by the Kremlin. Well, what the West is signaling with the deployment of these tanks is that we will meet you with that raising by supporting Ukraine ourselves, that we will increase escalation against Russia, that we're willing to risk that. And that means that in the spring fighting, we have to be really sober. This will be the bloodiest period of the entire war. It will be the decisive moment, the Stalingrad of Ukraine, where prior to this moment, Russia was fighting to try and gain something in Ukraine that it could call a victory to its own people. Well, after this spring offensive, Russia will continue to fight to prevent total defeat. It's a different mode of warfare and different psychology, not to mention the huge numbers of casualties that we have not seen since the Second World War. We've already seen, many tens of thousands of Russian casualties, many Ukrainian casualties, civilian deaths. There's been a real trauma in Ukraine over this past year. This is all going to pale in comparison to what we're going to see in the spring, when the huge numbers of Russian conscripts are thrown into the meat grinder of the battle in Ukraine, and where heavy tanks are going to be used by the Ukrainian forces to not only throw them back, but push Russian forces out of territory that it currently holds. How will these tanks be used? Well, it's a bit early to speculate. It depends on how effectively they can be employed and embedded in Ukraine's force structure. But I would estimate that the really heavy tanks, the ones that are the gas-guzzling sort of Abrams and the Challenger tanks, they'll be used to punch holes right through Russian lines. They'll be used in sort of frontal assaults to really smash through the defenses. We have to remember that unlike west of Ukraine, Russia has been in the east for many years. They have fortifications, defensive structures. They have various earthworks and embedded defense systems that are going to be very difficult for Ukrainians to enter. It's not like Ukraine is fighting on the defensive in an urban environment where everything favors them. They're going into territory where Russia has been for a long time. They know the area very well. It's close to Russian support and supply lines and reinforcement, and therefore the heavy assault vehicles are going to be required to just literally obliterate them. Meanwhile, I expect the Leopards, which will be far higher in number due to the numbers that will come in from Poland and other places, well, they will be embedded, I expect, with Ukrainian infantry units, the APCs, the Bushmaster assault vehicles. They'll be used to provide heavy fire support. That's because Leopard tanks are relatively fast. They can work alongside, advancing Ukrainian units, and they'll operate more, I expect, as a kind of mechanized cavalry, where on the one hand they can plug gaps, but also seize the initiative and take advantages of breakdowns in Russian communications or being outmaneuvered, much like we saw with the liberation of the Kharkiv Oblast, with the rapid counteroffensives that the Ukrainians were able to exploit. Well, the Leopards will be a force multiplier for those kinds of initiatives, and taking initiative from Russia, it really comes down to the robustness of the low-ranking officers in the Ukrainian military to see the advantage that the Leopard can bring and to actually take advantage of that on the battlefield. One of the risks to all this, of course, is Russian air power. while Russia's air force can't fly over the skies of Ukraine with total impunity, and we are seeing deployments of new advanced anti-aircraft systems like the Patriot missile battery, Western tanks are still going to be high priority targets for the Russian military. And it's not like the HIMARS systems, which are kind of fire and forget systems. They fire from a long way away, they conceal themselves, they have good tactics for avoiding returning fire. The tanks are out there in the thick of it, in the firing line, trying to smash through enemy forces. They're going to be seen by the Russians and they will be targeted by air power. So I'm curious, I don't know the solution to this yet, how they're going to be protected on the battlefield from above. I think they're going to be more than a match for the Russian tanks that are out there at the moment. The T-90s, definitely, they've been a disappointment, I think, from a Russian point of view. The T-14s that are coming out on the Russian side that are highly advanced, although still very few in number and not proven in battlefield conditions. There'll be some skepticism, I think, given the performance of their other tanks. And therefore, the Ukrainians are not only going to have a significant number of these Western tanks, 31 Abrams is nothing to sneeze at. There are 14 Challengers plus many dozens more Leopard tanks. Well, that is going to be a real intimidation factor for the Russian forces. To see these massive juggernauts of death just sprawling towards you, smashing through your defensive lines, I think that the Russians are going to be facing real challenges in this spring offensive, where they're going to be throwing hundreds of thousands of people into what is probably certain death. So overall, this is great news that the Ukrainians are going to have the military might necessary to really take the fight to the Russians in the east of Ukraine. It is going to take some time to train up Ukrainian soldiers to operate these tanks. It'll be difficult to provide the support networks necessary to supply and repair these vehicles while they're out there in the field, noting that we're talking somewhat difficult terrain. Things can get really muddy. Things can get bogged down. A damaged tank is a real liability because you're obviously trying to defend it and recover it. This will all be a big question mark. And then, of course, the defense from air attack from the Russian Air Force. There will need to be new countermeasures introduced, new anti-aircraft vehicles provided to protect these vehicles. However, provided that the Ukrainian forces, along with NATO, can solve these problems, it's going to be diabolical for the Russians to deal with. I mean, they've never faced an advanced armed force with heavy armor, along with all the other panoply of military force that Ukraine has been provided. They still have the javelins. They still have very skilled infantry. They're battle-hardened troops. All of that is going to be really difficult for the Russians to deal with. They've never faced that since the Second World War. And one has to say that the Russia of today is not like the Soviet Union of that period. They don't have the economic and industrial depth that the Soviet Union had. And thus we're now reaching a point where this conflict in the east of Ukraine is starting to look a lot like the Crimean War of the mid-19th century, where a Russian empire had it significantly overestimated its own power, just like the Putin's Russia is today. I don't know how Russia can drag any kind of victory given the sense of resolve that the Western allies continue to demonstrate. I think the message must get through to Putin eventually that there is nothing to be salvaged here. The best thing that they can do is withdraw from Ukraine entirely, spare the lives of the hundreds of thousands of conscripts that they're likely to throw away. There's even discussion now, on top of the 300,000 troops that have already been recruited and equipped, that Russia might raise another 500,000 on top of that. There are real political risks for Russia to do that, because it will demonstrate beyond all question that if Russia needs to raise another 500,000 troops after 300,000 troops that it's already conscripted, well, that demonstrates to the populace, no matter what the propaganda, that Russia is not winning this war. That will add further risk of revolution and overthrow of Putin's regime. And at this stage of the war, the only hope that Russia has had is that Western resolve would weaken and fracture and collapse. Now, the reverse seems to be happening. Yes, Germany had been dragging its feet in allowing other countries to export their made Leopard tanks to Ukraine, but with German acquiescence to that, it demonstrates that no, the new military objective is to drive Russia out entirely, and the Western allies are willing to do everything possible to achieve just that. The one hope, the false hope that Russia might take away from this is that the US military did advise against exporting Abrams tanks to Ukraine. However, the reasons for this were logistical. They weren't to do with the commitment for Ukraine's victory. It was to say it would be very difficult to train Ukraine's military in time. These tanks require a lot of support that the Ukraine military doesn't necessarily have, and therefore there's a massive logistical challenge in supplying Abrams tanks to Ukraine and having them combat effective. That's a completely different thing to say, we don't think we should be continuing to support Ukraine because the blood and treasure is not worth it. That is not what the US military is saying. That's my view. Let me know your thoughts. What do you feel about the tanks being deployed to Ukraine? How quickly do you think that they'll be embedded in Ukraine's forces, and what impact will that have on Ukraine's defense planning? Will they change their targets as a consequence of this new capability? Will Russian air power put a pause on how effective these tanks are, and how will we mitigate that threat? Love to hear your thoughts below, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.